Welcome everyone to the Pearson Business Book Club. My name is Eloise Cook and I'm the publisher for the Professional Business List at Pearson. Each month at the book club, we choose a Pearson business or personal development book and invite the author on to discuss it. They'll also give a webinar on a key concept from the book. And if you need to leave halfway through, the video will be available to watch on demand at the book club website and on YouTube. And today, this month, is pretty exciting as we're celebrating 2 years of the book club. And I'm glad that we're featuring an important book. So what is our book? So this month, it's Speak Out, Listen Up by Megan Reitz and John Higgins. And if you haven't got a copy yet, you can buy it through the Pearson bookshop. I'm going to post the link in the chat. So, welcome, Megan and John. Thank you for joining us today.
Good to be here, Eloise. Nice to see you.
Hi, Eloise.
Excellent. So I'll just introduce you both. So Megan is Associate Fellow at Said Business School, Oxford University, and Adjunct Professor of Leadership and Dialogue at Hult International Business School. She focuses on how we create the conditions for transformative dialogue at work, and her research is at the intersection of leadership, change, dialogue, and mindfulness. Very good. And John is an independent academic and researcher who has adopted the principle of living life as inquiry. In the last 25 years, he has interviewed and written about thousands of people from all walks of organisational life, with a particular focus on how different things look depending on where you are in the system. That's fascinating. So welcome, Megan and John. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so glad to have you here on our 2-year anniversary. So let's start with our usual questions. We always ask the same 3 questions. Megan and John, why did you want to write this book?
Do you want to lead
Shall I
off
kick
this
off?
time, Megan? Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'll kick off. Okay, so why did we want to write this book? Well, this, of course, is a second edition. So we published Speak Up in 2019. And there were a few very good reasons why we decided we wanted to update that and come up with a second edition. One of the key factors is we wanted to foreground something, which actually we wrote a lot about in Speak Up, but we wanted to literally put it on the front cover. And that's the listening piece. And I'm sure we'll come to that in just a bit. But speaking up relies on listening up. And we really wanted to show that the book was, really aiming at both our capacity to speak inside systems and explore our habits there, but also how do we listen and who do we listen to? So that was one of the key features. Also, over that period of I guess, 4 or 5 years, we saw remarkable change in the world. I mean, we published Speak Up before the pandemic, before technology reached quite the pace that it is right now, and before a whole pile of changes happened in terms of what are we allowed to talk about at work? What do different people think is a relevant conversation inside the workplace and what isn't? And over those period of 5 years, we also gathered a huge amount more data. And at the moment, it stands at about 22,000 people that we've surveyed globally. And we wanted to really update that in the book and update some of the data as well. So that's the reason for the second edition. I mean, there is an overarching reason why we wrote both of the books in terms of the importance of conversational habits, but I'll come to that, and John might say something on that as well. John, anything that you'd add?
Well, the only thing I'd add, and this is very topical given what's just been happening over in Google, and this is being recorded the end of May, and there's just been a big kerfuffle I think is a polite way of putting it, over in Google, where a number of employees were objecting to Google doing business with the Israeli Defense Force, and they did a sit-in, and then they got fired. And it was a fascinating X-ray of a corporate conversational culture, where I would say that the quality of both speaking out and listening were not very sophisticated. And to me, why the listening up has become really difficult, particularly for people in senior positions, is because where does an organization's responsibility begin and end is now up for grabs. And people are having to become skilled at having conversations that they are not experts in. And that was very much the traditional sort of leadership position. So to me, I think we make a distinctive contribution to how to be a non-expert in a conversation. And that has huge impacts for listening.
Fantastic. Next question. What surprised you about writing this book? And I suppose we can have this edition, perhaps, if you like.
Yes, this edition. John, I feel like you should go first now. I feel like I shouldn't go first every time, but I think we might say the similar thing here, but go for it.
Well, the thing that did surprise me, again, it surprised me as we're sort of testing various chapters on people, is how often you get an immediate defensive reaction from people, particularly once you start broadening the range of topics that people are meant to be skilled at. And it is, part of me shouldn't be surprised, is how defended people are, and how when they're asked to engage with topics that they're not used to, how tricky they find it. And the other thing is the persistence of the magical silver bullet thinking. Just had a wonderful response from a colleague who's an expert in the whole field of organizational development. He said this was, quote, a request from one of these big global companies over in the States, which is, we need more psychological safety and a speak up culture. And we're having a 30-minute webinar. Do we need anything else? And again, it's this persistence of, that somehow, you'll get Megan or I turn up, we'll give you a talk, and that's all you need. It's like, no, that is the first step to really quite a difficult journey. Megan, any of your things that surprised you?
Absolutely. So I would build on that is the book looks at habits. Yeah. And if you're listening in on this webinar right now, maybe you've tried to change a habit recently. And most of us are aware of how tricky that can be. Maybe we're trying not to be spending so much time on social media, or not to check our phone too much, or do more exercise, or stop working quite as much. All these habits are talked about quite easily. But actually, if we are going to disrupt them, we need to really engage with the habit. And, why do I do what I do? And from there, then our inquiry leads us to understand, okay, so where are the points that we can shift habits? And that's what we're talking about. And that's the remit of psychological safety, which is possibly the top topic in leadership and management over the last 3 or 4 years, is all around how do we have the tough conversations that we need to have in order to perform brilliantly well and flourish at work. Now, that, as I said, comes through persistent attention to habits and the disruption of some habits that have been in place quite a long time. So, yes, it does. The book very much aims at habits and how do you start to change them. And as John says, it still is a surprise how people kind of think, oh, no, we just want more people to speak up. Brilliant. But actually, it takes persistence. It takes some patience. It definitely takes prioritization as well to do all those things. So I think I'd concur with you, John, on the surprise there.
Fantastic. And lastly, how do you want readers to feel about reading your book?
I think I want readers to read the book and And actually, it almost like kind of they've wiped their eyes and they see something much more clearly that was always there and was always happening, but now they can attend to it. And again, going back to habits and what we say and how we hear, those things are of fundamental importance at work and also at home, actually. And I hope that people read the book and they kind of wake up a bit and go, wow, you know, my choices here and my habits here have enormous impact on the people that I work with, the people that I live with, and actually society as a whole. So I'd like people to kind of see that and be really, really curious and willing to experiment with it. And I'd like them also to feel, okay, I know some starting points here. I know some pragmatics, some practical things that I can start to do that will make a difference. So I hope people are fascinated by it. I am endlessly fascinated by the impact of what we say and who we hear. And if the book can instill that level of curiosity and inquiry in others and desire to experiment, then I would be a very happy author.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, and that's in terms of the mood, I hope people experience it as an invitation. And we do provide various frameworks, but they are frameworks for inquiry. They are not pieces of advocacy about you should know the world this way. We hope that through the material we make available to you, that you will know the world differently. But you are not going to have to know the world as we think you should know it. I mean, the one thing I really hope is that as a result of this, people will become more open to be touched by the experience of others. And this is particularly taking that moment of human connection seriously. And if I'm looking at a lot of the work that gets done in the speak up culture, even in the psychological safety work, it's the reliance on process. And obviously that's got its role. On formal programs, obviously they have their role. But actually it is in that moment of human connection, that moment of human contact, that's when life changes. That's when work changes. That's when you change and the person you're with changes. And you can't replace that with a process.
Fantastic. Well, I can tell you're both very passionate about this. So I'm really looking forward to the webinar, which is Psychological Safety, How Better, Not Smoother Conversations Can Deliver at Work. So remember, if you want to ask Megan and John a question, please use the Q&A feature and we'll get to those at the end. But I'll leave it to you two.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Eloise. So should I just say that John and I are going to talk with you, I hope, using the chat function, using a poll as well later on, rather than show you a string of slides. And where we want to start is in the topic of habit. So you and I and John have habits, loads of them. But we won't talk about many of them, apart from the habits that we have around when we speak up and what we tend to speak up about, and when we stay silent, what topics we're kind of really comfortable talking about and what topics we'd really rather not. Okay, we've all got habits around that. And we've also got habits around who we listen to. So whose voices do we really tune into? And whose voices do we kind of skip over or we ignore? Now, those habits define our lives. And I'm not exaggerating there. What we say, who we hear, defines our relationships at home, with our friends, in our communities, and at work. And of course, those habits also define our teams and our organizations. So it defines a team and an organization's ethical conduct. Obviously, you know, when John and I first started this research, you know, more than 10 years ago, it was very interesting. A lot of big organizations had their attention on compliance. It was right at the beginning, you know, VW emissions scandal, if you remember that, back in 2015. Organizations had their eye on, oh my goodness, we need people to speak up if there's something going on that means that we'll be on the front page of the newspaper for the wrong reasons. So obviously what we say and who we hear impacts ethical practice and also compliance. But then, of course, it impacts so much more than that. It impacts innovation and agility. You know, if you have habits where people stick up their hand and say, I've got an idea. If you have habits when people stick up their hand and say, I disagree, I'd like to really challenge the way we're thinking about things, you know, that can lead to really agile, innovative teams. If you have habits where people are afraid of doing that, or habits where people certainly don't want to disagree with people in positions of authority and hierarchy, then it's very difficult to become agile and innovative and creative. Okay. And of course, this topic is right at the heart of inclusion. You know, whose voices really do we hear? And whose voices do we need to be able to hear more from? Okay. So habits matter. And just a couple of points before we have a quick question for you that John will give in a second. A really important point in the book, and I do tell this story quite a lot because it was pivotal right at the beginning of our research. So pretty much the first organization I examined in terms of speaking up and listening up, a leader in this organization said to me, you know, we've got a problem because these people aren't speaking up. You know, these employees over here need to speak up more. And I went to talk to those employees, and those employees said to me, this is a direct quote, last time somebody spoke up, they disappeared. And so immediately we became very interested in the fact that I speak up depending on the environment that I'm in. I speak up depending on whether I'm invited genuinely to speak, whether it feels safe to speak up. In other words, speaking up is relational. And one of the biggest mistakes we make in psychological safety and in speak up initiatives is we look at the people that aren't speaking up and we try and fix them. Now, whereas there is always ways that we can be better at speaking up, this book focuses on that, but it focuses just as much, possibly a little bit more, on how do we create an environment where we don't need such bravery in the first place. So how do we listen? So that relational aspect of speaking up is really fundamental. And very quickly, we'll come on to this in a second, but suffice to say at the moment, we all tend to think we're better at speaking up and especially at listening up than we probably actually are. And when I work with managers and leaders on listening, one of the first blocks to get around is that most of them will think that they're already good at it. And we'll come on to the reasons why that might be the case in a little while. And the third thing I'd say, just in terms of foregrounding and you know, the context for the book and for this work is, as John was mentioning at the beginning, we've had organizations now, especially over the last few years, increasingly invite people to speak up. You know, we have speak up initiatives, we have psychological safety initiatives, we have bring your whole self to work initiatives. And now, sometimes, in some places more than others, employees are hearing this invitation and they're speaking up. And you know what? They're not necessarily saying the kind of things that leaders and managers had their mind on. And another just really quick story, a finance director said to me at a conference recently, I've been asking them to speak up. I've been asking my team to speak up for a while, and now they are. And he said, I wanted them to speak up about compliance. Actually, that's what I meant. I wasn't banking on getting everything else. So it is up for grabs right now. What do we want our employees to speak up about? When we invite them to speak up, are we leaving off the terms and conditions that go with it? So with that as a kind of context setting, John, over to you.
So there are all sorts of complex and rich theories as to why we don't speak up and why we don't listen up, and Megan has alluded to some of them there. But actually, the real reasons why people don't speak up are, we suspect, and our data supports this, are not rocket science. And often for people who make their careers out of wanting to sound, clever and sophisticated, to admit how basic what silences are can be difficult to admit. Now, if you could get ready on your chat, I'm going to ask you a question, and it's going to come in two parts. And now this is not one of these games where I'm suddenly going to ask you to think about something in confidence and then write it down. I'm not. I'm going to start off by asking you to think of something that within your organization you would like to raise that you don't feel or have chosen not to speak up about. And it might be that it's something to do with your personal contexts that actually makes a difference to how well you were able to contribute to your organization, but you don't speak up, you don't raise it. So if you can think, or there's a piece of feedback that you can think, if I could give that to a colleague or to a manager or to a leader, if I could give that feedback, it would make such a difference to them, but I don't do it. So just think of that situation. Have that in mind. Okay, I'll just pause for a second or two while you think of a real situation that you're not speaking up about. And again, I'm not going to ask you to put that in the chat. That's for you to personally just have mull. Now I'm going to get into the question that I would like you to share, which is why? Why don't you speak up? Why don't you raise this issue with the person that this would make a difference for? So again, if you could put some of the reasons into the chat, that would be very useful. Gosh, we got retribution. Directors and managers essentially don't care. Just want you to do their job. Career limiting. Don't want to be seen as difficult. Fear of being perceived as too emotional as a woman. Blimey, we're going to really get onto that one, Megan, when we talk about the labels that people have. Concern that response and feedback will be more disruptive to them than the benefit of hearing it. Sort of close to your FD's comment there. Boy, this is all very rich stuff. Some people have their heads in the sand. And they just don't want to hear something that doesn't fit with their worldview. So while you continue to put those through, and basically you've got all the reasons, but the top two that stood out in our research above everything else was the reason people don't speak up is because they firstly don't want to shame themselves. They don't want to do something that will make them feel smaller, be thought of less by their colleagues. The other thing, the number two, was they don't want to say anything that would undermine the authority of somebody else, that would make somebody else look a fool. And again, if you're thinking about these basic social requirements, I was going to say niceties, but they are the basic requirements of how we rub along in social settings, is we have to maintain our social web, our social network. And again, I think actually the comments that I've just looked at one here, which says, afraid I won't be heard properly. And again, that one for me, I was really struck by. So often we try and rush it. Somebody says, right, I'll nod, or they've tried to fit you into a box. And there isn't this time somebody doesn't dwell or actively seek out, can I just check I've understood what you've said? And in terms of some of our research, we spoke to people who work in family therapy. And one of the key first steps you do when you're trying to get a couple just to agree, largely to look after the kids, not to fix the marriage or relationship, is you just have to check that they have heard the other. And if you're a professional mediator in that field, step one is make sure that the other person feels heard. And our work life, which is so hectic, so busy, actually actively undermines that experience of being heard. Megan, anything shooting out for you from that you've seen coming through?
Yeah, well, you've picked up a couple of them. I'm quite interested in, we tend to form a narrative around, well, what would happen if? What would happen? And that's exactly what you've done. You've gone into your head and you've kind of go, well, what would happen if? And we often turn to our experience. What happened last time I spoke up? How did it end? What happened last time a colleague spoke up round here? And we also have stories, from life and from our childhood. What happens when I speak up? Is it encouraged? Is it discouraged? What happens if I challenge people in positions of authority? Is that respectful or disrespectful? So there's lots of narratives that come into our understanding of what might happen if. And I like this. The last comment here is, just because an organization implements psychological safety initiatives, it doesn't mean that people are speaking up. Yeah, and that happens all the time. We talk to organizations who says, no, we've been running an initiative, or the survey says people are speaking up. But we actually have to dig far deeper than that. We have to dig into, well, what are they? Yes, of course they're speaking up. People are talking. You can hear people's voices. People are speaking. But what do they feel able to speak about, and what don't they? And that has a big implications for us as individuals, but also our organizations and our society as well. So
before we jump on,
yeah.
Megan, there are a couple of things. One, I was thinking that it's the idea that silence is not neutral. We assume that because people aren't talking about something, that means it's fine. And it's not. You actually have to actively look for that. And there was just one other comment which reminded me of one of our very early interviews, which is, my issue is, and is mine, and I just don't know enough. And it's one of these, at one level, it's quite a useful attitude, but when it's overplayed, it becomes dangerous, is don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. And what that can happen is that individuals can sit on a problem and try and fix it at their level when it needs to be escalated. It needs to bring in other people for it to be solved. And that's part of the challenge, again, where people feel that everything is down to them as an individual. And how do you share stuff? There's a lovely quote from, I'm going to get him mixed up again, that US general, the team of teams guy, who's the idea that the center does not know what needs to be known in the field. And he talked about sharing information until it's illegal. And again, it's how you create a culture. How do you create a sense where I don't mind sharing something, even if I think it might just be something that I know. You don't know that this might be useful to somebody else. Sorry, Megan. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we've asked thousands of people the question that John's just asked you there. And we've asked them on surveys. As I said, we've got about 21 or 22,000 people globally, cross industry, cross sector, that we've asked. But I would say at least the same amount in situations like this and webinars. In the book, we frame, I guess, really the 5 most common responses to that question. In other words, the 5 of the really key issues that affect our choice about whether we speak up or stay silent. And they're actually also 5 issues that really affect whether we listen or not. So they're 5 issues that develop and build and keep our habits well and truly in place. And we call it the truth framework. And the book is formatted along the lines of the truth framework. So John and I will quickly run through that as it is a major feature of it. And I'll kick off with the T. And the T of the truth framework stands for trust. And we need to trust in the value of our own opinion. So we need to feel like we've got something to say, first of all. There's all sorts of interesting things that come into play immediately on that around imposter voice and various other things. But I've got to feel like I've got something to say, and it's got to matter enough for me to actually say it. And that's the trust in terms of me speaking up. But in order to listen, trust is really important as well. For the first few moments on this webinar, for the first few minutes, and probably still, you are assessing somewhere in your brain, is Megan and John, are they worth listening to? Do I trust that they may say something that's vaguely valuable at some point? Yeah. We trust some people's opinions about some topics sometimes. Okay. So the more we understand why we trust certain things and certain people, the better. And we'll come on to that in just a second. But that's the first aspect around trust that impacts speaking up and listening up. John.
So this all spells out the word truth. Which is kind of handy. So we had the T for trust. The R is for risk. And I think some of the comments to the answer to the question spoke to this. And this is the idea, what are going to be the consequences of me saying something or of me hearing something? And we have got plenty of, fairly negative stories about the risks that come from speaking up. This is a lot of our work overlaps with the world of whistleblowing. I've both done a lot of work in the whole NHS thing. And broadly, if you want to destroy your career in the NHS, be a whistleblower. The risks of speaking up within that organization are legion. I've attended numerous conferences, and it just reduces you to tears. And the notion that you can just go along there and say, "Oh, it's all changed now. The risks are going to be managed." They won't go. And often formal processes are introduced, but the social habits don't change. And having said that, that's the negative side, often we catastrophize. And it is this whole thing that we go from, if I say this, then my manager is going to think this about me. That means I'm going to be, when the next round of restructuring happens, I'm going to be out on the street. That means that within 2 weeks to 2 months, I'm going to be out on the street. That means my relationship's going to be break down. That's sort of, we ding, 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 ding. We just shoot up the ladder of inference. And the point is that often it is not as catastrophic. Particularly, and we'll touch on this later, is if we are politically skilled enough to know how to manage those risks. So that's about the speaking up bit of it. But there is also a risk of listening up. That we will hear something that we can't unhear. And that does mean more work. I do hear work here of some industrial settings where the managers quite deliberately say, I do not want to walk down that corridor because I know I'm going to see something that I have to do something about, or I'm going to be told something that I have to do something about, and I'm already too busy. I'm too full. And so this whole thing of the risk of having to change your worldview as well. We talked about, where does an organization begin and end? If suddenly the environmental agenda is becoming incredibly important to my youngsters, and there is a big generational divide there, then if I invite my young people to bring concerns into the public, if I say this is now going to be on our strategic agenda, boy, if I listen to them, that means we might have to change all our working practices or who we do business with. And that's a huge risk because I've got to explain that to people who are not at the same place as me. Megan, so that's the trust and the risk. You're on to the
trust and the risk. And now we're on to you. For those of you that are mentally spelling out truth in your head, U stands for understanding. And this is about politics. It's about politics and power. And much of what we tackle in the book actually is about politics and power and people's agendas. and status and authority. But understanding politics, speaking up is political in the sense that it often impacts people's agendas, our own agenda and other people's agendas. And it can impact our understanding of power and status and authority as well. So the more we understand our political environment, the more we might be able to skillfully navigate it. And similarly, on the other side of the coin, if you like, from a listening up perspective, when we're in positions of power, we hear stuff, but that is filtered through a political environment. And if we're not aware of that, we can sometimes think that we're hearing what is going on, but we're actually finding that we're really quite disconnected to what's actually happening on the ground. So the book goes into, you know, what do we see as politics? How do we navigate political environments? And how do we understand what's on people's agendas, what's on our own agenda, so that we can speak up and we can listen up more effectively? And one of the key reasons, I suppose, architecture around politics is around titles and labels. And John's going to ask you a question around that in a second.
Well, I was going to say, are we going to do the polling now, or shall I do a bit of framing? I'll do a bit of framing, and then you can lead in with the poll. So this is again, it's part of when we're talking about power and politics in organizations, is one of the established norms that emerged in the 1970s was the notion of the flat organization, and it disappeared hierarchy. And we would argue that this is a deeply unhelpful position for most people. Yeah, all organizations. People in groups create hierarchies. They create status groups. And these status groups often manifest themselves in how different titles are. So I speak as I'm a white man. I am of a certain age. I am of a certain educational background. I can play, I'm a British public school boy, which brings a certain usefulness in certain things. Although when I'm working in, let's say, parts of the NHS, I found that the words posh twit are used if I'm very lucky to explain me. So that's part of the title. I have an Oxbridge background, which again is a high status label in most contexts. If I wish to establish that, yes, you can trust my intellectual abilities, it's one I play. And there are always certain titles that have greater or lesser status. Now, I think this is one of where we're going to play this. Before we do that, or the one thing which is slightly, it's not contentious because it points in that data, is the way that people desire to disappear titles and labels. Because often, particularly in the modern era, people want to say, I am not influenced by certain things. So one of our subgroups within our data set identified, I think it was about 117 people at an early cut who identified as being either at board level or execco level. And one of the questions was, are you ever influenced by somebody's gender or race when they're speaking to you or listening to you? And every single one of those said never or hardly ever. Now, and this, by the way, is in an anonymous academic survey. So there's absolutely no comeback. It might be that they didn't trust how anonymous this was, but it seems to both of us incredibly improbable that all those people did not carry around within them some learnt prejudices. And in terms of how we talk about those sorts of prejudices that come with those titles can be very awkward. So one of my older business friends who worked for one of the big US companies phoned me up and he said, can I have a clumsy conversation about race with you? Because he said, there was the corporate norm and he didn't understand the sensitivity of the language because he needed to make sense of it with somebody who would allow him to be unskilled. And the trouble was that, the title of a white man talking clumsily about race was going to walk him into a world of pain. But anyway, sorry, I've gone on a bit there, Megan. But should we do the poll now?
Yes, let's do the poll. And I've got an eye on timing, so we'll go through this fairly soon because we want to take you on to a couple of differences that we've got in the book. Here's a poll for you. Which of the following labels do you think significantly affects whose voice gets heard in your organization? If you're not part of an organization, maybe a community or an organization that you're working with. Hierarchy, what about that? What about gender, ethnicity, age? There's department and specialism. You know, are you in HR? Are you in finance? Are you in sales? There's location of work. You know, are you in headquarters or the regions? A lovely ambiguous one here called being in the in-group. We'll leave it that at the moment. And then number of years at your organization. And as you vote here, just to make one really important observation about titles and labels, the same label can mean very different things in different organizations or in different contexts. So an example I usually use is the label HR. So I can work in some organizations where the label HR is high status. So the HR director finds it easy to speak up. When she does or he does, they get heard. And I also work in organizations where HR is low status and it's sales or it's commercial or it's finance or it's one of the other departments that comes in above. And that has implications for how HR's voice is heard in that system. So let's have a look at what we've got here and share the results. And what a surprise, hierarchy's top. When John and I work with apparently flat organizations, hierarchy is still top. We've got hierarchy, department, being in the in-group. You know, are you connected to people? That's quite high there. All of them resonating, actually. And I think that the key thing around titles and labels is noticing the titles and labels that we place upon ourselves and that we place on others in particular systems, and the implications that that has on voice. I'll mention advantage blindness briefly here, then maybe John.
Yeah.
And when we have the high status labels in a particular context or system, it's far more tricky to notice those labels and the impact that they have on others. When we don't have the right labels, when we don't have the high status labels, it's far more obvious to us. The impact is far more obvious. And we call that advantage blindness. And it matters because, to give you a very straightforward example, when we have a director or a chief executive label on us, of course we know it impacts how people approach us, but we're likely to underestimate it, actually. We're likely not to see the big impact that it has. And part of our work that we do in the book is just really saying, look at these labels. You may not be conscious of them, but they are the kind of architecture that holds in place the kind of conversations that are possible. So if you're going to change your culture and you want different people to say different things and be heard in different ways, you can't do that without attending to how you understand status and authority. If how you understand status and authority stays the same, then you're very unlikely to disrupt the kind of conversations that are going on. Okay. Lots and lots of that in the book. And very briefly, because we want to talk about the last couple of chapters, H in truth, and we get to the how to. So there is lots and lots in the book around, okay, how do I speak up effectively? And how do I listen up effectively? And one of the frameworks we use is called the 5 W's. Who, why, what, where, and when. Who do I need to speak to? Who needs to hear me? Why? What's my positive intent? What verbal and body language do I use that means I'm more likely to be heard? And where and when do I raise this? Similarly, whose voice do I need to hear? And why? What happens if I don't hear them? What verbal and body language do I use that helps that person to feel at ease? Can I spot some of the things that I do that silence others? And where and when, again, do I invite somebody to have a conversation? Is it in the team's weekly meeting, or is it in a one-to-one? Is it in the office? Is it going for a walk around the block? You know, environment makes an enormous difference. I don't know whether any of you are lucky enough to have two teenage daughters like I am. But if you have teenagers, you know, there is truth in that story that says, you know, if you've got a tricky conversation to have, actually having it in the car is quite effective, because there I am sat like this, and there's the teenager. You don't have to make eye contact, and you can kind of go, so how's it going? And you have a very different conversation than when you're, I don't know, over the dinner table and staring one another in the face. So lots in there around, okay, let's get pragmatic. How do we actually have these conversations successfully? And much of the book is framed around that truth framework and getting us to really understand why we do what we do and how do we do things differently. And before we come back to Eloise and she hopefully do ask some questions in the chat or the Q&A, I was about to say, you know, please do put some questions in there. We want to just draw attention to two kind of really key changes in the book. And one of them is around what we might call activism, and one of them is around technology. And John, do you want to just talk through the first of that?
So within the activism chapter one, first of all, is activism is in the eye of the beholder. One of the bits we do is say the definitions that are out there go from, you know, people who are on the side of the angels to hippie Marxists. It's, you know, quite when you use the word activist, it evokes a very strong reaction in people, and there is no agreed meaning. Broadly, it is people who are disrupting the status quo in some way, shape, or form. And what we looked at was how the range, the taxonomy of responses that organizations have. And we identified about 5. I'm not going to run through them now, but broadly they split between the defensive and the constructive engagement. And most of the organizations we speak to are very strong on the defensive. And this is where the compliance type of thinking comes in. But one of the fascinating divides is how different levels of the organization see it. And actually, the more senior you are, the more you think your organization is having a constructive, generative engagement with activism, whereas people at more junior levels tend to see an organization's response to activism more in a more defensive way. They see a less optimistic, less generative engagement. And so that is a fascinating divide there. So that's all I'll say about the activism piece there, Megan. And you're going to do a little bit about the wonderful world of technology.
Technology, yeah. Just to pick up, John, I mean, that is one of the most important points, especially when we work with organizations and leadership teams that are trying to develop psychological safety. One of the most important things for them to hear is, and this is really clear in our data, as you get more senior, you are really likely to overestimate the degree to which people feel able to speak up around you. And you're likely to overestimate your listening skills. And you're likely to think you're more approachable than you actually are. And that puts you in what we call an optimism bubble. And it's a problem, because then when you're in that position, as far as you're concerned, well, people are speaking up and I'm listening well, but yeah, my door is always open. Therefore, I don't need to change. I don't need to change my habits, therefore, if everything's fine. And that's one of the things, that's one of the bubbles, if you like, that we need to burst straight away is, I'm afraid to say that if you're in different parts of the organization, you probably don't see things the same way. So how can we highlight that, and how can we start working with habits?
And I'm just going to risk now, Megan, I was just going to say, in terms of the technology bit, is broadly, if I was trying to summarize it in one point, it's the technology amplifies your existing culture. What happens is the technology is not neutral. It simply plays out and makes stronger whatever your established social pattern is.
Yeah.
And I'm just aware if you can do 1 minute more on that, that would be, then we'll go over to Eloise.
So we often talk about technology and AI as if as John said, as if it's kind of value neutral. And we often think that we're putting it in organizational systems that don't have existing power structures and that are safe. And obviously both of those assumptions are very unlikely to be true. And so what we do in the book is really explore with things like AI, how is that likely to affect what we talk about and how we talk? And how is technology likely to affect how we listen to one another and whose voices we trust and whose voices get amplified? And so we look at the difference that AI and other technologies can make via a number of different scenarios that sort of project us into the future. You know, one example might be, and we sort of see the positives here, but also the possible consequences. For example, technology might enable a boss to get coaching on how to help others to speak up. Technology might tell them when they're taking too much airtime, for example, in a meeting. So there's some really positive possibilities if the person in a position of power wants to use it proactively and generatively. However, there are also some negative consequences. So how technology is used and the difference it will make to our conversations depends very much on some of the issues that we've talked about already. In particular, how is power used? How is technology used? Is it used to enable voice, or is it used in a kind of power over way, which might suppress certain voices if we're not careful? With that, Eloise, are you there? And please do let us know if some questions have come in. It's a whistle-stop tour of some of the of what you can find in the book.
Yes, I am here. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. I always love the examples. Yes, we do have some questions coming in, so please keep keep posting them. So first one, does the culture matter, i.e. USA versus UK, when it comes to adapting the habits of speaking out and listening up?
I'll leap in first of all. My example of one organization we talked to, its HR department turned out to be the Chinese Communist Party. And I can assure you that its speak up culture was completely wrapped up in that particular institution. So the answer is yes, and it's more complicated than that. It's when you are operating at a global scale and you get the collision between different value sets. I remember we've been doing some work looking at donors from the global north to West Africa around a particular, in an NGO, a particular aid project. And they wanted to tie the aid to certain LGBTQI initiatives. And the trouble was that they were trying to apply those values in a context where if you were in that local West African context and spoke up about LGBTQI, you would put your life at risk. And again, so that's an extreme example, but yes. Megan, anything else on that?
Yeah, culture, nationality, how we've been brought up is, one of those labels. It's one of many labels. So it is much more complex than saying, oh yeah, Americans do it this way and the Brits do it this way. Actually, it's a label, and then the organization has its culture, of course, and then there's all manner of other departmental, location, age, gender labels that also come into play. Of course, different cultures around the world tend to have different perspectives, in particular on what we call power distance. So what does it mean to challenge people in perceived positions of authority? And that would be one of the biggest cultural elements that affect conversational habits that we've been talking about.
Can I leap in again on the next question? I got to remember to read it out. As a new member of a team, how important is it to speak up about the work practices? Now, you're in a real double bind here, because of course, as the new team member, you're often invited in because of your difference, because you're bringing in new skills, new energy levels. But the trouble is, to stay a member of the group, you often have to let go of that. And this is where we often put the responsibility